Good afternoon. Welcome to the Woodchuck Report on this fine day, Monday, July 30th. Oh, I forget what day it is. So let's get into it. Today's a special day since it's not a live airing, and as I said, it's Monday. So it's going to be a taped taped show. Today's topic I have chosen for is tariffs, as usual, my current love of the century. So let's get down to business. All of you who haven't seen the show before, well, you know how much I love tariffs. So, getting to it, last Tuesday, on the 24th, President Trump, he announced, he announced more or less a bailout, about $12 billion for some of the farmers. Now, quick recap, he's been adding tariffs and using the very obscure rule of national security to add tariffs to imports. He's saying a lot of these imports are hurting American consumers, workers is what he's aiming at. And so he's enacting a bunch of tariffs. As signatories to the WTO, we can't unless there are national secret interests at heart, which is the rule he's using, which is very rarely, if ever, done, and he's kind of setting the precedent for it. Obviously, he targeted China, and so doing so, China retaliated. Now he's going after both the EU and our neighbors to both the north and the south. So the new EU one is going to be coming up. He's hinting at it. It will be about a 20-25% tax on imports, on auto imports. For those of you who may not know, BMW, Volkswagen, Audi, Porsche, any European-made car are the imports that we get sent here, that get sent from them to us here. But back to the China one. China retaliated first since they were the first target of that, and so they retaliated on agriculture. And so the biggest hit was the soybean farmers. Now about 64% of American soybeans goes to China, so it was very strategic in them targeting the agriculture and specifically the soybeans. And so in doing so, this tariff battle we're getting into has started to hurt the soybean farmers. So, Trump has now announced, like I said earlier, on the 24th, there are about $12 billion worth of aid that's going to be going specifically in direct payments now to soybean farmers. Now, the exact amount isn't known. It's approximately $12 billion is what they've forecasted, but until actual harvest season, they won't really know what the full amount is. So, now, the topic of tariffs, I should probably go back and say, what are tariffs? And so today's little special airing is going to be all about tariffs and what they do, what they are, and kind of what they do. So if you try to follow along, I'll try to keep it simple. So for those of you who maybe have never taken Econ 001 or Econ 101, will get an understanding. So tariffs in the simplest way is nothing more than a tax. It's added to the cost of imported goods, and as one of several trade policies. Now, tariffs are paid at customs. For example, if auto imports coming, say, from Germany, the tariff on that will be paid at the U.S. Customs and Borders. So the exporter will have to pay it then and there. Now, so the reason why tariffs are created, there's several reasons why tariffs are created, and it's usually to protect growing industries, especially in developing countries. So one of the other many ways is, the reason for is to protect domestic employment, protecting consumers, infant industries, national security, in which Trump is using the claim to, and because of retaliation. Someone else started a tariff war with you, and you're retaliating back. So there are different types of tariffs and trade barriers that governments may employ, such as special tariffs, ad valorem tariffs, licenses, importer quotas, voluntary export restraints, and local content requirements. Now there are a couple of others too, but those are some of the major ones that we have seen in the past being used. So currently Trump is he has import quotas currently that I know of, and he's using the reasoning of national security. And for example, China is using the retaliation tariff because we put a tariff on them and they're retaliating. And EU is gearing up to do the same thing as well. Now, so those are the basics of tariffs and what they are. Now, who benefits the most from tariffs? Now, because a tariff is nothing more than a tax, the government is the one that actually sees the increased revenue. So they're the one that benefits the most initially. Now, domestic industries also benefit because now they have reduced competition, since all the imports, their importer competitions are, the prices of that is being artificially inflated. So who loses out are individuals such as you and myself, and businesses who use whatever those tariff quotas were, tariff goods were. So they end up seeing higher prices, which ends up being higher prices for the end product. So, for example, we use steel consumers. So any steel from, say, Canada or Mexico, which is not being hit with a 20% tariff, would now be at a higher price. So any producers of, say, canned goods will have to pay the higher tariff price. On the other hand, and also consumers who buy those canned goods will also be paying a higher price. So who benefits the most from that would be the domestic steel producers, or, well, in terms of canned goods, the aluminum producers. So in the short run, the higher prices for goods will reduce consumption by both individuals and businesses. So back to our aluminum example, you'll see a reduction in consumption of the aluminum by both the individuals and the businesses who use the aluminum. Now, this tends to change over the long run because businesses will start to see a decline in efficiency. This is due to a lack of competition. So, as we said, competition helps improve efficiencies in the market. So, you will see a lack of reduction, and they'll also see a reduction in profits because you'll start seeing substitute goods. So in case of canned goods, you might see some, well, other types of goods that could be used to can. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any. I'm sure aluminum, thin wall steel, and, well, anything off the periodic table, really. Ceramics could also be used if made cheap enough and durable enough for the consumer taste. So, for the government itself, the government will end up seeing an increase in demand for public services, and this is due because consumers will have inflated prices, which will tend to reduce and offset their disposable income. They'll have less money to spend because they're paying high taxes on, say, the canned goods, their food goods, especially on the agricultural side. So they'll tend to go more towards social and public services. Now, how exactly do tariffs affect the prices? Well, the tariffs affect the prices because there's an increase in the actual price of the imported goods. If you're importing something for $5, you put a $2 tariff, now that total price is $7. So domestic producers who are not forced to domestic producers will not be forced to reduce prices from competition. They have less competition, so they tend to act in a more monopolistic tendencies, and domestic consumers are left to paying the higher prices because of the higher imports. Now, the tariffs will increase prices, and what they do is limit the volume of imports. Higher prices usually have a reduced imports, all else staying the same. Now, since these prices are increased, more domestic consumers or more domestic companies will be willing to produce the goods. The higher prices will tend to add more quantity in demand, or quantity in supply. So, and it will increase as more domestic companies will increase the goods, and which in the overall effect will actually end up reducing imports, increase domestic production, and increase higher consumer prices. As I said, they will shift the prices up for the consumers, And because the prices are higher, the domestic producers would be willing to produce more. But everything else increases, and you end up having sizable deadweight loss. So, but today in the modern world, modern day's trade, the rate of tariffs has been declining steadily since at least the 1930s. And this is one of the many reasons is of some of the, and many of the international organizations, the big one being the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And they have made it so anyone who's signatory of the WTO is made more difficult to levy taxes or levy tariffs and taxes on imported goods, which tend to reduce the likelihood of retaliatory prices. So the whole agreements tend to reduce the likelihood of trade wars, with exception, obviously, the one we currently have using the national security stipulation. Now, a lot of these international organizations, they attempt to reduce production and consumption distortions, which are caused by these tariffs. Excuse me. Like the domestic producers, making goods due to inflated prices that tariffs add, and consumers purchasing fewer goods because of higher prices. Now, a lot of these tariffs have been declining since the 30s. Since the stock market crash, really, and obviously the subsequent World War II. And a lot of these, especially the reduction in tariffs and trade barriers, which has helped increase global integration, which brought along globalization. Some people have a negative viewpoint of globalization, but overall, globalization has helped increase consumer choice, consumer demand, and overall welfare of countries who do embrace and adapt very well to globalization. Now, for a lot of the multilateral agreements, NAFTA being a prime example of the one between us, Mexico, and Canada being the three largest signatories to that. So these multilateral agreements, they increase the likelihood of tariff reductions, which was the point of the NAFTA, was to reduce barriers of trade between the three major countries. There are other countries in NAFTA as well, but Mexico, Canada, and the US were the three main ones. So it helps reduce trade barriers, and also it allows the different countries to enforce binding agreements, and which helps reduce uncertainty. Now, in closing, I would just like to say, one of the best things that we have right now, especially in the global market, is that the fact that free trade benefits all consumers. It benefits them through increased choice and reduced prices, and it helps, with the global economy. With the global economy, it helps reduce uncertainty, because uncertainty is the killer of many and all markets. Now, many governments impose tariffs and other trade barriers, to protect their infant industries and certain industries, especially when it becomes political, i.e. our steel workers and our metal workers here. But it has to be done so that a delicate balance can be achieved between, say, the pursuit of efficiencies, in the market and in governance, and the need to ensure that low unemployment, because that is a side effect of increased globalization, is it tends to weed out the inefficient companies and industries and help increase unemployment, at least in the short term. In the long term, that there are policies that can be done to offset that. So with that, I'd like to say, free trade benefits all. We should strive very hard to maintain and to increase free trade. But something I've heard saying is, and I'd like to point out, is that free trade is not fair trade. It cannot be, both by definition and in practice. You cannot have something be free and fair to all people. So I would discuss that in the next segment. But for that, I'd like to say, you all have a good time and keep it up.